My name is Gaia Nafziger, and I'm the Graduate Student Coordinator for the LAEP Speaker Series. Thank you for attending our Kenyon House Distinguished Professor Lecture in the Department of Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning. The mission of the Speaker Series is to engage our students and faculty with thought leaders in the allied design professions. These talks are recorded for posterity, for use in studios, and for the greater community. We ask you to be engaged and polite during the talks, to listen and quietly take notes, to avoid digital distraction, and to stay for the entirety of the talk. A short Q&A and acknowledgement will follow, after which you can scan the code for attendance and meet upstairs in the common studio for more conversation and refreshment. Today I'm introducing Nick Jabs. He asked if I could skip his introduction, and unfortunately for him, the answer is no. But what I can do is keep the embarrassment to a minimum. So I won't list all his credentials, achievements, and awards, though believe me, there are many, and instead I'll focus on his work. Nick's work is grounded in what he has described as an empathetic pragmatism, integrating ecological performance with cultural and social narratives. His projects consistently seek to bridge architecture and landscape while prioritizing stakeholder engagement and long-term resilience. As Octavia Butler wrote, "All that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you." This ethos resonates through Nick's work, where design is a reciprocal and transformative process between people and place. Having the opportunity to learn from Nick this semester, I have observed his diligence and incisiveness in the way he approaches his projects. His ideas are quietly radical in how they challenge us to think about public space and its potential to improve everyday life, and his commitment to crafting meaningful public open spaces alongside his advocacy for the future of the profession through teaching, civic engagement, practice, and research is inspirational. Since I lied earlier when I said I would keep the embarrassment to a minimum, I want to tell you all that doing a site tour of the project Nick is leading in Boise recently, 2 different people who work with him there used the word genius while describing him. So we can all know that for this lecture, we're in very good hands. Please join me for giving a very warm welcome for Nick Jabs.
Only slightly embarrassing, so thank you, Gaia. Thanks everyone for coming out tonight. I hope, I've had great 2 semesters here. I know many of you in this room. I've been able to work with many of you, and I hope that the talk tonight will be able to provide a lot of context to some of the conversations that we've had throughout the semester. I'm going to dive right in. My work consists of the research, design, and implementation of public realm projects across a range of scales and contexts in the United States. This is a work in progress. Everything I'm going to share with you today, both the work and the conceptual framing of the work, is very much an evolving set of conditions. I want to start by identifying 3 themes that underpin my work. The first is an affiliation for the obscure, the overlooked, and the out of the way. These are the places that I think I'm most comfortable in, operating at the fringes, trying to find inefficiencies. I think, to me, they feel like home. I'm a Midwesterner at heart. I'm from here in Jordan, Minnesota, a small rural farming community in the southern portion of the state. For those of you that are curious, Todd and the rest of the Johnson clan are from here in Wilmer, Minnesota. But I grew up here on a quarter of my grandparents' dairy farm. It's both a bucolic landscape comprised of creeks and woodlands and a working landscape full of livestock, grain silos, and milk barns. Of course, there are also strange innovations like this thing, which is essentially a flying go-kart. I later moved to Arkansas to study architecture, which most people didn't exactly understand at the time, but I think the scrappiness and the authenticity of both the program and the place really appealed to me. One year while I was in school, a friend and I worked for an artist, and our job was to drive motorcycles throughout the rural counties in northwest Arkansas to get photographs of barns and farm equipment. That we would later help George, the artist, translate into his work. All of this is to say that I have a deep appreciation and fascination for these strange, wonderful places and their vernacular. The second theme is assemblages. This is my fascination for how things are put together. Growing up on a farm, many of my evenings were spent in a shop with my dad, tinkering on some kind of machine, a car, a tractor, motor he was working on for a printing press. This is an image I found while working on my thesis project that focused on the site where these farm-all tractors were manufactured in the Quad Cities. This is my grandpa a few years ago. thought I could get through this. He passed away a couple weeks back at 95 years old. So he lived, he had an entire lifetime as a dedicated steward of all things living and mechanical. I think we all have something to learn from his generation in that regard. I know I did. This was my first motorcycle. It didn't run when I bought it, but I had a lot of fun taking it apart and putting it back together. I got it to go around the block once, and then I sold it. But my interest in trying to understand how things come together mechanically is certainly why I enjoy design. This comes through in some of the more architecturally focused projects I've worked on, like the pavilions at Aspire Park and this massive green wall at the U.S. Pavilion at the Milan Expo. But I also have a fascination with with understanding what it means for public space to be put together. I first saw this diagram while I was a student at Arkansas when Susanna Drake lectured there, and I remember being really captivated by it. The fact that the water, the shade on the water was somehow the jurisdiction of an agency was really crazy to me. Over time, my interest in how things come together mechanically is expanded into trying to understand how other kinds of systems, whether they be political, legal, or economic, and how these different kinds of machinations enable the work that I do, which is making public space. The third theme, our fragile commons, is understanding the broader political and economic context of my professional career. I started my undergrad program at the University of Arkansas in 2009 in the midst of the worst economic downturn of a generation. In 2016, I started grad school during one of the most divisive political campaigns of the modern era, which turned into a presidency that shook the social and political foundation of the country. In 2020, I undertook a fellowship with the Landscape Architecture Foundation and became a licensed professional during a global pandemic and a second once in a generation economic recession. And more recently, I've spent the academic year here with you all while we collectively grapple with the implications of artificial intelligence and experience domestic and international upheaval combined with the dismantling of institutions and norms. I share this not to give any of the slightly older folks in the room PTSD, but hope to illustrate the point that my entire academic and professional career has been played out against a backdrop of these rather intense social, political, and economic catastrophes, not to mention the rapidly warming climate. There really is no good transition from that, so I'll just dive into the first section, which is practice. Since graduating, I've worked at Port, a nimble multidisciplinary practice combined of landscape architects, urban designers, and planners, singularly dedicated to the design of the public realm. Though narrow in focus, we work on a wide range of projects at scales and typologies. This includes urban furniture, spaces for community gathering, pop-ups and activations, the development of urban plans, regional conservation strategies. Urban plans. Regional conservation strategies. We do this for public and public-facing entities across the country. We have something like 98% of our clients are public in nature. One thing that really appeals to me about Port, though, besides the emphatic focus on the public realm, is the willingness to engage with, frankly, weird places. Places like under-elevated infrastructure, congested leftover intersection spaces in Philadelphia, dead-end highways in Knoxville, Tennessee, and more recently in places like Bozeman with their creek that flows under buildings in their downtown. I'm going to talk about two port projects. The first is Waterside Park in North Franklin Township, Pennsylvania. This is a planning project funded by a grant from the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. North Franklin Township is a community of less than 5,000 people and located 45 minutes outside of Pittsburgh. In 2021, when we started working on this project, the township had no real public space or civic facility. Its most significant commercial base was a dying mall from the 80s. They defunded their police department, important in their own words, before it was cool, not out of some ethical or moral concern, but because they couldn't afford it anymore. And our project focused on this 89-acre site that was owned by the local water utility company for the last century, but recently acquired by the township. Because it was owned by the utility and largely fenced off, the landscape we found was a mixture of strange and beautiful, not exactly wild, natural, or man-made, but something else. The township, to their credit, saw it as an opportunity to reposition itself regionally by investing in quality of life improvements for their existing communities and to attract new people to the area. Here's a drawing that illustrates how the site was used when it was part of the municipal water supply infrastructure. This infrastructural legacy is also understood within the broader ecological context. Chartiers Creek, which runs through the project site, is one of the most polluted waterways in the state, which under the MS4 program of the Clean Water Act requires that the township correct the water quality issues. There's some amazing moments on site where all these characteristics come into close proximity with each other. In this case, the pond from the infrastructural era, the creek, and the preserved woodlands. Also worth noting, North Franklin Township sits in the middle of fracking country. This book, Amity and Prosperity, which was published in 2018 and won a Pulitzer Prize the year later, tells the story of the heart-wrenching impacts of the fracking industry on the individuals, communities, and the environment in which these two towns, Amity and Prosperity, in those two towns. North Franklin Township is less than 10 miles away and subject to many of the same conditions. Both sides of the politics are very much present here. This billboard is paid for by the state senator representing this area, is prominently displayed along the Pennsylvania Turnpike. All that to say that this is a place facing constant tension of resources, both natural and capital, which provide context for our work in this oddly shaped 89-acre site. We began by understanding the site through a set of mapping exercise illustrating the various constraints and opportunities, and a series of events were held to engage stakeholders and the general public. Something like 200 people came out to this event, which is a lot for a community of this size. One of the key things we did, because the site was fenced off and inaccessible for the last 100 years, was to take people out onto guided tours of the site so that they could experience the types of landscapes present there. One of the stories I like to tell about this project is that North Franklin Township has exactly 2 municipal employees. They do everything. They answer phones, they send tax notices, write meeting minutes for council meetings, they do permits, manage projects, literally everything in the town. One of them is a woman named Erin Dinch, who we lovingly refer to in our office as the living embodiment of Leslie Knope, the character from Parks and Rec. I'll forever remember arriving to the site the day before this community event and finding Erin standing in the middle of the creek with her hip waders on, pulling out tires that had been there for like decades. But also, her husband and cousin were bushwhacking and mulching trails on the site. Her son was posting information about beavers we found. It's really this level of commitment and passion that the folks have in this community. It's really incredibly inspiring. So this combination of desktop analysis and on-the-ground experiences and stakeholder engagement led us to this summary. There are areas on the site that represent assets to be amplified, and areas that are liabilities or present limitations to be corrected. In the urban design studio, we would refer to this as a kind of hard and soft analysis for all my urban design folks in here. In some ways, our work was simple. Develop a framework plan that responds to these constraints and opportunities while artfully providing access to the site, connecting it to the adjacent neighborhoods, and making space for ecological restoration, but most importantly, creating a civic core. The resulting plan is anchored by a 1-mile greenway threaded through the site to provide accessible walkways to the various features. Chartiers Creek serves as another spine through the site with a range of conditions around which we develop strategies for bank restoration, floodplain enhancement and storage, and improved access points. And then integrated 2 places for community gathering. The first, shown here, is the Civic Anchor, which develops spaces of collection around the old water filter building and the new municipal building that was planned for the area. Of note, in this particular drawing, the community didn't have a lot of requests for us, but one of them was that they wanted to have a place where they could host a holiday village and do a tree lighting ceremony. So the pine tree there was rather important. The water filter building is currently being restored as part of an initial phase of the project. But overall, this area is designed to create a hub for social activities. It has play areas, pickleball courts, spaces for festivals, water recreation, and passive landscapes. In the south, another type of community anchor was developed, this one with a different character given its proximity to existing and planned wetlands and the local public schools. Carefully positioned between the site's utility constraints, this area prioritizes play, outdoor classrooms, and controlled access to areas of landscape restoration. And finally, we always want to be conscious of how the project can or could tie into the larger regional initiatives, in this case, a series of trail networks linking commercial areas with ecological assets and neighborhoods. But this work must also align with the township's capacity. All in, we were estimating this to be around a $12 million project. In general, that's a pretty modest sum for an 89-acre project, but of course miles away from what the township of this size with a relatively conservative leaning could afford at once. So we broke it into something like 20 different phases, very small chunks, but at funding levels that were achievable for the township. They have very limited capital, so basically everything they do has to go through a competitive grant application process. Since we've completed the framework plan, there has been consistent momentum behind the project. The first couple of phases are actually overfunded through grants, and the businesses have been moving back into the mall, citing the public space project as motivation for doing so. I'll end with this. Aaron and Jackie, the two municipal employees, sent us this shortly after we finished the planning process with them. It's a new seal for the township, and at its core are the elements of their civic space: the town center, the greenway, the creek, and the pond. To me, it's a small but important symbol of their enthusiasm for centering the public realm in their community's future. And here's that seal, proudly in the background of this photo, with the township staff and their state senator, the same one who proudly declares through a billboard that the Green New Deal is America's off switch. I share this not to celebrate the triumph of green space as a great healer of divides or to suggest that the project can correct for the devastating environmental effects facing the region, but rather to underscore the complexity of working in the public realm, especially in conservative areas of the United States. Two principles to take away from this project. Good design starts with good listening. Listen, support, and elevate the people in the communities we work. And good design can happen anywhere, for anyone, and at any budget. All right, on to the second port project, the Park at Expo, Idaho. This project is an 80-acre transformation of a horse racing track in the Boise metropolitan region. The client for this, which is important to note, is actually Ada County, and the site sits within the Western Idaho Fairgrounds, or Expo Idaho, and adjacent to Garden City, a small, underserved, but rapidly changing and gentrifying community along the Boise River. Gambling, and therefore horse racing, was outlawed in Idaho starting in 2016. So this is how we found the site, a set of vastly underutilized facilities with no public access and very little ecological function. There are a handful of other efforts that were important leading up to this project. In 2015, a group of experts and citizens produced the Boise River Enhancement Network report, the Bren report, which identified the two side channels along this stretch of the river as some of the most important habitat in the urban reach of the Boise. This is the site while functioning as a horse racing facility. This is the site in its pre-development condition in 1952, where you can see the braided, multi-channel nature of the river. Also in the late 2010s, a housing boom started in the Boise region, which then exploded during the COVID pandemic, creating a housing shortage, which folks are still grappling with today. And two planning initiatives were undertaken in 2020 and 2021. The first, a Citizens Advisory Committee, was established to evaluate the future of the Expo site in general, and specifically the track section. And the second, a technical assistance panel organized by ULI, which provided recommendations as well, all which pointed to keeping Expo Idaho operating on the site, but transforming the racetrack into a public facility. And then, in response to the impacts from the pandemic, the federal government passed the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, or ARPA. One of the things this bill did was funnel money into every jurisdiction in the country for a wide range of approved uses. Because we collectively came to understand the importance of getting out of our houses while having 6 feet of space around us, the creation and enhancement of public space was one of the approved uses of ARPA funds. Ada County set up a two-part RFP process, first shortlisting 3 teams based on qualifications, and then conducting a competition with those teams. We spent the first couple of months of the fall of 2022 developing our competition entry, a strategic proposal which created dense areas of recreation along the urban edges of the site and vast areas of open space, only slightly modifying the existing water courses. The case we made to them in our presentation was getting permits to do anything transformative on the water with the water on site will be impossible given the tight timelines associated with the federal funding. Focus your energies on investing outside the floodway and on other active areas. We won the competition, which was great, but then we had our first meeting with the county and they said, look, we really like you guys, but you need to start over. We want all the fun program stuff to be up by the river, and we might do a land swap with the southern half of the site. Of course, we responded by saying, that's great, we'll do it, which kicked off this process whereby we had to go from 0 to full contract documents, complete bids, and a contractor on board in under 2 years, and then fully constructed and open to the public 2 years after that, all of that being mandated by the federal funding. So we got to work, starting with an understanding of the relationship of this new park within the context of the Boise River Greenbelt system, which is an incredible resource on the whole, but mostly has a narrow definition of what a public park can be, dominated by vast swaths of turf grass, requiring incredible amounts of maintenance and irrigation, while providing modest features outside of their passive landscapes, with a couple of notable exceptions being Catherine Albertson and Esther Simplot Park. Given this, what are the opportunities for this site? A park being born out of a global pandemic and with a denuded landscape with very little present in terms of the original riparian character. Maybe because we're not from Boise, but we became fascinated with the collection of contrasts present throughout the region. Things like the difference between the river and the ranges, the extreme wet and dry conditions, in some cases very close to each other, the heat and the cold, and even within the site, the notion of expo and park, but especially the historic condition of the site relative to what was there. And in this way, using landscape types as a way to talk about the existing site today and its future possibilities. The goal became to express this massive range of characteristics, the ecological transect, throughout the site as a way of developing a park for the 21st century. But to treat it not as an if project, but as an and project, one that maximizes places for people and nature. And we had to do this with minimal amounts of levels of community engagement. Frankly, the compressed schedule mandated by the federal funding didn't allow for much of that beyond what was required by the county's administrative processes. With all that, I want to dive into the specifics of the design. I was talking with some of the seniors the other week, and they're trying to figure out what the catchphrase was for each of the professors. And I think for me, they arrived at frameworks. Just frameworks. So I'll start with this, which is the framework for the Park at Expo Idaho. We start by positioning 3 programmatic anchors at the entry points for the park. The green belt, the orange line, is a massive regional thoroughfare, so positioning a destination scale play area and an all-wheel sports area, these big spaces of collection at either end of the park to serve that audience. And then a large plaza along the edge of Expo Idaho to ensure a meaningful connection between the park and the fairgrounds. That leaves the entirety of the center of the park for shaping topography, strategically cutting the middle to connect the site to the floodplain and using that material to create exaggerated mounding along the edges. This allows for the area of cut to function as the ecological heart of the site, which manages and incorporates multiple water sources, surface water, stormwater, groundwater, and backwater. Circulation is connected around the perimeter of the site, creating a primary loop, and secondary and tertiary loops are developed to create multiple itineraries within the park. Ultimately, that leaves us with these distinctive zones of the project. They work together, certainly, but they also can be isolated, studied, developed, and experienced independently. The first area is centered around nature-based play. It combines a range of experiences for exploring and adventure with the facilities and spaces for people to gather and extend their stays. There are big play features like climbing towers and slides, more passive forms of play like a misting area, and a large flexible plaza that can accommodate food trucks and small performances. And this is that area earlier this year. The green belt is the path in the foreground. You can see the relationship to the center plaza there beyond the misting area. Beyond that, just the misting area and then the pavilion. The pavilion is has a pretty simple program. It's basically just bathrooms, but has a large presence through its exaggerated volume. This in part to act as a sign or beacon for the park, and is matched by the scale of some of the play features, like this big swing. Our client is disappointed that it's not the biggest swing in the United States, but he does like to say that it's the biggest swing west of the Mississippi, and I think that's true, but regardless, it sounds good, so we go with it. And then we use the relatively subtle topographic change to create other unique experiences, like slide scrambles or this climbing wall. The climbing wall is designed to fold at the upper level to be a bench on one side and a spinner wall on the other. There isn't a lot of planting out there right now, but in these anchor spaces, we specified large caliper trees and soil cells to create as much shade as possible, as much instant shade as possible, expecting these areas to be highly used. 50% of playground users are not children. It's important that these spaces are designed for caretakers as well. The second sub-area is the all-wheel sports garden. In some ways, it's just a fancy name for skate park, but it's also a declaration of the expanded nature of skate parks today, where they are meaningfully integrated with the landscape, and recognizing that, like play areas, these spaces are multi-generational. They're for people from a huge diversity of backgrounds and experiences. We worked with some of the best skate park designers in the world. They designed the skate park at the last 2 Olympics, and one of their stair sets is copied in this project. This area also includes another bathroom pavilion. This one is designed as a concrete shell with steel edges embedded around the edges to account for skating activities that will undoubtedly take place there. And there's a roller derby track on the left side of the image here. That track is there because one of the 2 community engagement events we did was held specifically kind of around the skate features. And at that event, a massive group of well-coordinated and very enthusiastic women from the local roller derby league came out and advocated for the inclusion of the flat track. So there it is. The third sub-area is the lowlands. This is the ecological heart of the park and was created through the massive cut operation, all of which facilitated the goal of connecting the site back to the Boise River floodplain as much as possible. This is important. You'll remember our competition proposal. We intentionally did not touch the water on the site because of the anticipated permitting issues. Well, it quickly became impossible to avoid and the critical path item to completing the project. On top of this, the county's lawyers were both skeptical and risk averse, which I understand. There's a lot of money and opportunity costs at stake with this project. If they don't spend the money, they lose it. It just goes back to the federal government. If we don't get our permits, the project doesn't happen. I think their preference would have been to pursue the most conventional approach, basically put in turf grass and call it a day. But we couldn't accept that. Through this process, myself and a number of people at Port had to take a crash course in water rights legislation in Idaho in order to become effective environmental and public space advocates in the very litigious and pretty conservative context. I wish I could tell you exactly how much time I spent writing memos and outlining the myriad considerations and possibilities with regards to the ecological approach to this site. It's certainly more than I care to admit over that time. Eventually, we did convince them, and we did get our permits. And we were able to keep the creation of highly productive ecological landscapes centered in the project. Access is carefully coordinated in and around this area. Mostly the paths are routed around the outside of the inundation zones, but boardwalks are used in some locations. And this is where the site ties into the side channel. Enhancing the ecological productivity of one of the most important reaches identified in the Bren report back in 2015. I was on site earlier this year, and the channel is earlier this week, and the channel is fully operational. After the spring flood releases are done, a couple of 100,000 plugs will be planted in this area. The woody debris that you see here, the woody debris that you see here is to create floodplain roughness. In the short term, this is to prevent water from just flowing across the surface. Eventually, the planting will be established and many of these structures will be left in place to decay and create small pockets of habitat. Okay, the last sub-area, the ridges. These topographic features are created from the fill taken out of the lowlands. They're used to create a sense of arrival and gateway between the park and Expo Idaho. The weathering steel sheet pile walls and the bridge above acting as a threshold moment. Along the top of the ridges, the elevated position allows for views to the foothills to the north. This is one quality that we noticed on our first site visit while in the grandstands. When you're on the site, especially when you're close to the river, the view is dominated by the riparian corridor. But when you're elevated, even just 20 feet or so, you get these incredible views to the foothills. Again, trying to create a range of experiences in the park. We spent a lot of time studying the form of this topography through sketching, physical models, digital models, and a lot of grading. I have a really incredible colleague named Dorothy who probably graded this entire site 4 or 5 times throughout this process. And there are strategic moments to really amplify the scale of the topography. I think you get the sense of it here, seeing how the circulation and the topography really come together. And around those moments, furnishing is deployed to create spaces of collection, not necessarily at the same scale as the play and skate areas, but smaller and more aligned with the passive nature of the landscape. And finally, connecting the site back to the broader context of Garden City, the Expo, and the site's legacy as a horse racing facility. Through the design of elements like site signage, railings, and the repurposing of certain features like this observation tower. The project changed a lot through this process, from the competition to what is being built today, but there remained a consistent commitment to maximizing both ecological benefit and experiences for people. All of this is made possible through the COVID relief bill. The ARPA program represents the largest federal investment in public spaces in the United States ever. And the Park at Expo Idaho is the largest single investment into public space as part of this program. 2 takeaways from this project. Embrace uncertainty rigorously. Nearly every day throughout this project, me and the wonderful group of people working with me were faced with constant questions that lacked ready-made answers, forcing us to move beyond just designing and rather strategically problem solving for the public good. And become an expert and an advocate. For better or for worse, especially in the public realm, you will always need to prove your work. That likely requires you to become an expert to some degree in many different things. But if you don't stand that work up with moral conviction, you won't get very far. And that is a form of advocacy. The second theme I want to talk about is research. At least my relationship to research as a student, a professional, and a practicing academic. Throughout my career, the notion of research has taken many different forms. First, as a young professional working on this publication, which was an opportunity to explore how drawings can be used to tell a story. As a student, my thesis work was ultimately about self-discovery and the first step of establishing a personal research agenda. Also, as a student working on this data visualization project, that was a catalyst for a larger advocacy position. And in my teaching, exploring novel or systemic questions, this one focused on design listening. But the research project I want to unpack a bit today is Constructing the American Public Realm, or CAPER. This is an initiative conducted collaboratively with the McHarg Center at the University of Pennsylvania in Port. This research really began from our practice, specifically our role leading the design of 4 large public park projects. Each is located in a different charismatic natural landscape. These projects are all green dots within politically purple communities and all situated within a broader conservative or red context. But despite these similarities, these 4 parks have entirely different operational models, funding structures, and administrative setups. I've already talked about the first 2, Waterside Park in Pennsylvania. This is an 89-acre park funded entirely by public grants. The Park at Expo Idaho, the 88-acre project, the first phase of which is funded entirely through a federal program. But also in Clinton, Tennessee, there was Aspire Park, which is an 85-acre park, fully funded and operated by a private foundation for a town of about 10,000 people. And in the rapidly growing metro area of Northwest Arkansas, our 110-acre Gateway Park is funded via a public bond measure with significant investment from one of the world's largest philanthropic organizations, the Walton Family Foundation. These differences in funding across the 4 projects led us to a central question. How does public space in the United States get made? And by made, we mean how is it conceived, funded, built, occupied, and operated? At the core of our research are 2 questions. How is public space valued? Parks and open space in the United States are often treated as secondary to other urban systems like housing and infrastructure. We want to ask, are we truly recognizing their value as essential civic infrastructure? We also need to ask, who is advocating for public space? Unlike housing or education, public spaces lack a strong, coordinated network of champions. This creates real risks for their long-term investment and maintenance. As designers, we see ourselves as advocates for the public realm, but we need to broaden that pool of advocates. These questions led us to produce this set of 64 cards, which is a primer on public space funding. This tool embodies our research journey, where the focus of the investigation itself became a product of further inquiry and dialogue. We see this primer as an opportunity to spark community conversation, facilitate dialogue among stakeholders, and engage design students. It is also a tool to advance public scholarship. I have 3 copies of the cards. This is the interactive section of the presentation. You guys can let's see, who wants to take it over here? Move it. Yeah, so that's the deck of cards. I'm going to walk you through some of our methodology and how this process unfolded. We began by focusing on case studies in 9 major cities across 3 general latitudes, each with populations ranging from 300,000 to 2 million people. They are generally legacy industrial cities or Sunbelt cities. These cities are intentionally not New York, LA, or Chicago, but are deliberately diverse, Dallas versus St. Louis versus Portland, all distinctively different to highlight a range of contexts. Within our 9 cities, we looked at 3 different types of kinds of public space, starting with signature projects. These are large, high-profile projects often located in downtowns. They represent significant capital investments and are designed to serve a wide audience, from city residents to regional visitors and tourists. Next, we looked at connective projects, which we define as alternative mobility corridors designed to link one point to another. These projects are generally neighborhood-focused, but have the potential to attract a wider audience when they connect to larger transit systems. While they often involve smaller capital investments, the complexity comes from their need to span multiple jurisdictions and forge partnerships across stakeholders. And finally, we looked at neighborhood projects, which are smaller, local spaces focused on serving immediately adjacent communities. These projects tend to have smaller budgets and are often localized in terms of who they serve, offering a more direct user connection to larger public spaces. These typologies help us understand how projects differ in investment, scale, and audience. So these 27 cards, 3 projects from each of the 9 cities, represent our first deck of cards. Each card captures the story of a project, assessing its origins, partnerships, implementation, scale, budget, and funding sources. We found that every project has a unique funding narrative. Some of these stories, like Splash Pad Park in Oakland, were pretty straightforward. A community park principally funded through the city's general fund, and some support in the form of community fundraising. In contrast, Clyde Warren Park, a 5-acre deck park in Dallas built over the Woodall-Rogers Freeway. With a construction budget of $112 million, it was the largest project in our study. The project is funded through a mixture of public and private investment and is closely tied to real estate development and transit infrastructure, reflecting the broader forces shaping the park's funding and management. As these case studies progressed, we noticed a series of funding mechanisms that came up over and over again. I'll draw your attention to the lower right-hand corner of this card where you can see icons that indicate this project was funded through the city's general fund, public funds, municipal bonds, and philanthropic organizations. These observations led us to create a glossary that highlights key categories and tools that we've seen in the park financing across our 27 projects. We sought to unpack, synthesize, and summarize them into a series of terms, which in turn led to our next set of cards, which helps communicate the complexity of public space funding mechanisms in a way that's easy to reference and digest. We also developed a comparison framework, which allows us to assess the parks side by side, focusing on their cost, function, and complexity. When we charted all 27 projects across 11 axes, we were able to observe specific patterns and relationships between scope, scale, and budget. This comparison helped us see how these elements interact across different sites, revealing how variations in governance or funding impact the success and longevity of public spaces. Take, for example, this comparison, which looks at sources of funding for the 27 projects. Most of the projects we studied use a hybrid funding model, combining public and private sources. One of the things that comes forward in this comparison is that for cities with limited access to public funding, private, often philanthropic, funds were necessary to fill the gaps. We see this in our signature projects and neighborhood parks in St. Louis, which is a city with one of the lowest operating budgets across the 9 case study cities. These patterns and relationships led us to realize that it wasn't enough to just look at the projects. We needed to understand the broader context they existed within. So we studied the governance structure and administrative frameworks for each of the 9 cities. We used Trust for Public Lands Park Score fiscal year 23 data to situate the sources cities rely on to invest in public spaces. This allowed us to see the relationship between public and private funding across public and private funding sources and their per capita spending. It also allowed us to see how these funds were spent across categories like maintenance, administration, programming, and capital and acquisition. We were also interested in understanding the Parks Department position within the city's governance structure. Curious if the organizational hierarchy of a Parks Department impacted its decision-making authority, budget stability, and ability to prioritize public space. What we observed through our case studies was that Parks Departments that were deeply buried within the city's broader administrative structure often faced challenges in securing consistent funding and political support for public space investment. Conversely, when a Parks Department or board holds a more prominent or independent role, like in Minneapolis, it tends to have a greater autonomy, more direct access to resources, and a stronger ability to shape the city's public space agenda. This led us to another set of 9 cards that break down the organizational and funding structures of each of the city's Parks Department. These cards assess where the departments sit within the city's administrative framework, its operating budget, and the scope of the systems it manages. As referenced earlier, this research culminated in 64 cards across 5 categories. These cards are not a kind of final word, but a living tool to explore the layers of complexity in public space creation. What started from a simple question of how do public spaces get made expanded as we worked through this process, leading us to explore the broader mechanisms that shape public space creation. From our research, we've developed a series of key takeaways. These takeaways are not novel, and for many of us in this room who work in the public realm or will soon work in the public realm, they will sound familiar. The first is that public space funding is volatile. Funding priorities shift with changing political administrations. Parks departments often face cuts that are constantly being renegotiated, particularly when buried deeper within the government structures. When funding for parks comes from discretionary sources, it ebbs and flows depending on the broader city's needs, often deprioritized behind other municipal current concerns like housing, infrastructure, and policing. Minneapolis shows what's possible when the parks have stable funding. Their Parks Board, which is an elected body, operates independently with its own funding and its own taxing authority as well, giving them stability that most cities lack. This independence has helped Minneapolis develop one of the strongest park systems in the country. Navigating this volatility demands strong champions, but it also means working through the complex webs of partnerships and funding models we've encountered throughout our research and practice. Second, public space funding is complicated. As observed in our practice and from this research, there are no 2 projects that are alike. Each relies on a different mix of public and private funding. For example, in Philadelphia's Dilworth Park, the primary funding came from transportation infrastructure grants, but is ultimately funded through transportation infrastructure grants, This ultimately supported the creation of a vibrant public space. That project is now independently managed and financially supported by the Central Business District. Every project, whether large-scale signature projects or small neighborhood spaces, required a mosaic of public and private partnerships to be realized. And finally, public space funding is limited. We need greater advocacy for public spaces as essential urban systems. Currently, public space funding is highly dependent on public-private partnerships. The involvement and capacity of private entities is subject to shifts in the economy, leaving questions about the precarity of the growing reliance on private and philanthropic funds. This dependence also raises critical questions about publicness, equity, and access. This research certainly isn't complete. The information presented here represents a snapshot in time, and it also has led to a number of other questions we would like to pursue. One of the great things about this project is all the ways that we've been able to share it with others. This has happened informally in conversations as part of structured discussions on projects at national conferences and in classrooms with students. And this fall it will be the basis for a convening session with the Mayor's Institute on City Design. And with that, a couple of takeaways. First, remain curious. Keep asking questions and investigating your hunches. And second, focus on impact. As a practitioner, the most important aspect of any form of our work is that it has a positive impact on the material conditions of people's lives. Okay, last section. This is the most in progress of everything, so bear with me. It's also going to get a little existential for a moment. At its core, this is about an underlying anxiety I have about the prospects of our discipline to enact real and meaningful change at scale. Just to illustrate the point, there are about 16,000 ASLA members, but over 19,000 municipalities in the United States. So hypothetically, even if we wanted to put a landscape architect into every town or jurisdiction to help inform the numerous decisions that are made at that level, which impact the built environment, we couldn't do it. In his polemical essay, Billy Fleming notes, contemporary practice is focused on sites, not systems, and on elite desires, not public interests. Our work is limited in scale and subordinate to client demands. This critique resonates deeply with my observation that our profession has traded its civic leadership for technical compliance. It reinforces my underlying concern that if we don't learn how to operate at the level of systems and politics, we cannot fulfill the vital contribution to democracy that our discipline is uniquely positioned to make. Also, that as long as we remain subordinate to elite demands, we will continue to overlook the certain communities that need our systemic thinking the most, but lack the traditional client structures to ask for it. There are two texts that I'm pulling from here that I would encourage you all to read that have helped me develop a mental framework for understanding these concerns in their historical context. First, Billy's work traces the friction between professional practice and politics, arguing that our focus on isolated sites often blinds us to the political systems organizing and activism that shape them. Meanwhile, David Leonhardt's explores the link between politics and democracy, showing how the health of our institutions dictates the quality of our collective life. There's a vital connection here. If our practice is political and politics is the engine of democracy, then the design of the public realm is not just a technical service, it's a democratic necessity. My hypothesis, which is not exactly novel, is that in order to deliver on this promise of our profession, we need new models of working. If we replace discrete sites for a regional mandate, then the discipline can be positioned as a practice of strategic leadership, aligning systems-based thinking with social and political movements driving material and civic change. This last project, the development of a regional organizing and advocacy nonprofit called the Riverline Communities Collaborative, is my attempt to test this theory. The Riverline Corridor is a 37-mile infrastructural and ecological spine that connects Camden and Trenton along the Delaware River in New Jersey. It's also home for me. I live there in Riverton. I moved there from Philadelphia in the March of 2020, the same week that the non-essential systems across the globe were shutting down due to the COVID pandemic. During the following months, I became endlessly fascinated by the place. There's a huge range of landscapes, including the dense urban cores of Camden and Trenton that anchor either end of the corridor with their university and legislative-based economies. A number of small towns with vibrant, compact main streets that still retain the fine-grained architectural density of their pre-industrial and river town origins. Large infrastructural landscapes that are both strange and a stage for spectacle. Landscapes that include protected farmlands and riverine conditions. Some with weird histories like Burlington Island, which was used as an amusement park around the turn of the century. And labor hubs, both contemporary last-mile warehouse districts and historic company towns like Roebling, where they manufactured steel cable that was used in things like the Golden Gate Bridge. But despite all of this, this corridor lacks any coherent public identity. Most people wouldn't even identify it as a region in and of itself. I think there are a number of reasons for that, but the main one is because the corridor touches 2 states, stretches through 3 counties, and has 18 separate municipalities along its length. This jurisdictional jumble and siloed nature of planning and development prevents any compelling public imagination of the place from taking hold. That, among other reasons, is why myself and a few others have started the Riverline Communities Collaborative, an emerging nonprofit with the mission to act as a convener and advocate for the region with the goal of creating a regional framework plan that will cultivate the latent public imagination of the place. This is another instance where I'm woefully qualified for certain parts of the work. Establishing an organization, obtaining nonprofit status, creating bylaws, developing resolutions are all not things that I thought I would do with my career. But it's a little like water rights in Idaho. I've been able to surround myself with a lot of people smarter than me and slowly, consistently, and strategically advance this initiative. At its core, I'm trying to lead through design. I believe that design leadership is the act of reclaiming a future of bold collective endeavors, centered on community needs, guided by a shared vision, and measured by the dignity of the everyday. 2 principles to end on. Design is not neutral. The time for passive, apolitical practice is gone. Embrace it. And none of this is done in a vacuum. Lead through design collaboratively. Shared a lot of different types of work with you today. Ultimately, this is about looking beyond projects as isolated events. By integrating practice with research, we can step into civic leadership roles where we don't just respond to a brief, but actively frame the problems that matter most to our communities, a form of activism and advocacy. These principles represent my attempt to find a footing in this expanded field. I offer them not as a final answer, but as a framework for you to test and refine. During the last lecture, Simon Sinek and the importance of finding your why was brought up. Well, I'd like to invoke the eternal wisdom of Dolly Parton and say that find out who you are and do it on purpose. You as individuals and we collectively as a discipline have, as stated in the LAF Declaration, a vital contribution to make to the world's most pressing issues. Get to work. Finally, none of the work presented here is done alone. Super grateful to the mentors, colleagues, collaborators, and students, many of them in the room today, that I've had the pleasure of working with. I know I wouldn't be here without their support, and this work would not be possible without their collaboration. Especially thankful for the folks at USU for giving me this opportunity for this talk. And if it wasn't clear, the studio that we're doing is adjacently related to some of that last project. So super thankful for the university and especially the students in that studio for going on that adventure with me. I'll stop there and happy to open it up to questions. They didn't think I could get through 109 slides in 55 minutes. I was pretty confident.
Okay, does anyone have any questions? Okay, Cameron.
Thank you, Nick. This is awesome. You've already established that funding is volatile. I'm curious if on that Expo project you anticipated that amount of funding and then all of a sudden that got pulled or significantly reduced. Like what would have happened? Like would you still have pursued like value engineering to a higher degree, or would you have reduced the scale? How would you go about that?
Yeah, I think I talked about this a little on the trip in Boise for the folks who were there. This is the power of a framework. Let's go back to it. Our framework plan basically didn't change. And there was a moment very early on in the process at the end of preliminary design where we were about to present our design to the county board, the commissioners, everyone. And about a week before we presented it, they called us up and they're like, hey, what you're showing is way too much money. Like, we cannot show a project at this scale. So we basically went back and we said, here's our framework. Regardless of how much money we have, it should be done this way. So we, in the last minute, kind of like made a handful of adjustments, and we made a kind of low investment scenario plan and a high investment scenario plan. And also, made a lot of really nice graphics that basically convinced them, yes, we should go all in on this. We should, we have this ARPA money. This is a once in a lifetime opportunity to commit funding to something like this. We should do it. But yeah, I mean, I think we think about that on almost every one of our projects. I mean, we don't, like our North Franklin project, funding for that is not guaranteed in any way. So the framework is in place. It can be a small playground, it can be a big playground, it can be a lot of ecological stuff, it can be just some bank enhancement. But yeah, that's kind of our approach to that.
That was a great presentation, Nick. Thank you. For Boise, for the Expo Park, you mentioned that there were limited public participation. So do you think that was, what was the implication for the project? Do you think the project would have been even better with more? Do you think, what's the public response now? And anyways, it's kind of an open question.
Yeah, it's a good question. Overall, the public response has been really positive. I think in part because we took an and approach, not an or approach. It kind of mostly has a little of something for everyone. Some people don't understand why we don't have equestrian trails or like why there isn't a dog park, but there hasn't been a lot of that. Would more public engagement have changed the project? Almost certainly, yeah. We probably would have refined some of our decisions a little bit. But two things. One, the prior planning work, which although didn't have a huge level of engagement associated with it, did provide something for us to reference. Like we had a pretty good sense of what people did or did not want at a high level based on those documents. And then the client group structure was really interesting. Basically, we had a core group of about 4 people that we worked with at all times in the county. And they represented different departments in the county, from Expo, from operations, from the director of the Parks and Waterways, and from their engineering department. And they did a lot of the, let's say, back-end engagement. They like went out, they spoke to a lot of people, they, told them what was happening, had conversations with special interest groups, especially on the Parks and Rec side. Like they were those boards were oftentimes involved in the process of the project. It's a good question.
Okay, we have one more. So.
That was amazing. Thank you for that. My question's more so with the leadership, so the last part of the presentation. But it seems like you are starting to build, right, that network, those like key players in really everything you're building through that program. So how are you going about finding those key players, finding that community who obviously have the passion like you would as well, but can be those people who maybe if you're not an expert in this area, they can be that for you?
I have a sort of general disdain for lawyers, but I've found some really good lawyers, and they've helped with a lot of the administrative stuff. There's a pro bono network, basically, that I applied to and said, hey, I want to do this thing, and they took me on as a pro bono client, and so that's been really incredible. Otherwise, a lot of it is, it is developing a network. A lot of it is, I kind of left the slide out, but one of the things that I've found since moving to Riverton is that the sense of community I have with the folks there is really strong. It's really deep. And they're people that are super well tied into the political and economic and cultural groups that are in that area. So, certainly not. And then, I have connections on the design and planning side. So it's, in some ways, it is just about finding the right mixture of people who can bring about that level of agency and influence. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, that's all we have time for, so I'm sure you all have a lot to say and more questions for Nick, so we can continue this up in the Commons studio and give one more round of applause.